Hello and welcome to today's webinar hosted by Rails to Trails Conservancy's Trail Nation Collaborative. We're so glad that you could join us for this session. My name is Yvonne Mwangi and I'm the Trail Resources and Planning Manager here at RTC. Our topic for today is working with railroads, productive partnerships for successful projects. This is the first of a two-part series on working with railroads. Today's webinar kicks off our conversation by providing both railroad and trail manager perspectives to highlight good practices and lessons learned to advance these convergence and keep your negotiations on track. Part two, which takes place on Thursday, November 21st at 1 p.m. Eastern, will be an hour-long Q&A session where you get to hear directly from RTC experts on your rail trail and rail banking dilemmas. You can register for this session using the link in the chat. And we also invite you to submit your questions for that session in advance using the registration form. Now, today's session is brought to you by the Trail Nation Collaborative, RTC's peer learning community uniting leaders, advocates, and professionals from across disciplines to advance connected trail and active transportation networks nationwide. Through proven tools and resources like the Trail Nation Playbook and expertise from RTC's Trail Nation projects and partners, we collaboratively tackle challenges to accelerate the development of these trail systems. So this is how it's going to flow today. Once I'm done with housekeeping, I'm going to turn it over to Liz Thorstensen to do the moderation. She was going to start by setting the stage, and then each of our panelists, Damien and Tim, is going to present. We'll follow that up with moderated discussion and Q&A. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce today's panelists. Damien Deanna is the Director of Real Estate, Sales, and Leasing at CSX Transportation, Inc. His team handles all outgoing real estate transactions for CSX's network, which includes 21,000 miles of property in 23 states and 2 Canadian provinces. Damien has spent the last couple of years at CSX modernizing the company's approach to building partnerships and collaborating with trail sponsors and government entities to encourage rails to trails developments which spur economic development in the communities in which they operate. And so Damien will be sharing CSX's approach to rail trail negotiations and some recommendations for smoother conversations. Timothy Bartlett is the Executive Director of Parks and Recreation for the Urbana Park District, where he has served since 1992 in various roles, becoming Executive Director in 2014. A registered landscape architect, he's also a visiting lecturer in landscape architecture at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and serves on local foundations and several professional associations, including the American Society of Landscape Architects. And Tim will be sharing the process and lessons learned in the development of the Kickapoo Rail Trail. Liz Thorstensen is RTC's Vice President of Trail Development, and she leads a multidisciplinary team advancing RTC's Trail Nation program to accelerate regional trail and active transportation networks nationwide. With over 15 years of experience dedicated to fostering sustainable, equitable communities, Liz has spearheaded impactful public-private partnerships supporting economic recovery, resilience, and inclusive infrastructure. And Liz will be moderating today's session. Okay, we're going to take a pause here. I'm gonna launch a poll, so you all let me know if you can see this poll. And the purpose of this poll is just to let you, we just want to understand who's on this webinar. How are you coming to this topic? So if you can see the poll, go ahead and vote. There are 4 questions in total. The first one is simply asking how you work on trails. Question number 2, how have you successfully negotiated to turn a railroad right-of-way into a trail? Question number 3, what kind of railroad have you negotiated with? Is it a class 1, the largest railroads? Is it class 2, class 3, short line? And then number 4, if your negotiations were successful, did you make use of rail banking? And we'll hear a little bit more about rail banking during Liz's section. All right, so I can see, okay, we have about 32% of people have responded to the poll. Most people here are trail planners or managers or working in nonprofits. We have representation from advocates, volunteers, state agencies, regional or municipal representatives. That's 25% right now. Gonna give us another minute. All right, all right, all right. Perfect. All right, I think we can end the poll. So yeah, so we can see a sizable group here are trail managers and nonprofit. Also notable is regional and municipal representatives. So people from MPOs, Council of Governments, local municipalities, very interesting. Have you successfully negotiated to turn a railroad right-of-way into a trail? 46% said no, they're here to gain background knowledge, which is great. But we have a couple folks who are currently negotiating, and we have others who have multiple successful rail trail conversions. That's great. What kind of railroad have you negotiated with? Looks like most here have negotiated with Class 1 railroads, and we're really lucky to have a representative from a Class 1 railroad on this webinar today. And then if your negotiations were successful, did you rail bank? Yes, no, most people did not rail bank, so 68%. It would be interesting to learn what acquisition method you all used for that. 32% did actually rail bank. Again, we'll be hearing a little bit more about rail banking during Liz's section. So, all right, that's super interesting. And with that, I'm gonna turn it over to Liz to set the stage.
Thanks, Yvonne. Hey, everyone. We're so glad you're here today. I'm Liz Thorstensen, Vice President of Trail Development at Rails to Trails Conservancy. One of the questions we get asked most frequently in our technical assistance, talking to folks all over the country like you all, is how to work effectively with railroads on rail trail projects and acquisitions, given the unique challenges and complexities involved in those transactions. So we're really excited that with this webinar today, we are doing several things. We're delighted to have Damien and Tim here to start this conversation. As Yvonne mentioned, next week, we're doing a follow-up dialogue with our general counsel, Andrea Furster, who's been specializing in this skill set for over 30 years to answer your questions. And I'll show you in a few moments a new splash page we're launching with all of these tips and resources and guides to help you through these processes. So I'm going to do a few things. I'm going to walk you through what the common challenges are, explain how rail banking can be a powerful tool in this process, and share our practical advice for building effective negotiations and partnerships with railroads, along with resources to support you in this process. So let's dive in. So what are some common challenges that often come up in negotiating rail trail acquisitions? We know valuation and appraisal differences can often happen. Appraisals are a very unique skill set in linear corridors, specifically rail corridors. You can't just use any typical appraiser in that process that you would use in another real estate deal. It's a very specialized skill set. So that's a huge process to work through, that valuation and appraisal process. Complex legal and regulatory requirements. Is there already an easement there? How is that going to transfer? Are there environmental considerations? All of those things go into a lot of complex situations that have to be worked through, usually with legal support. Long timelines and timeline discrepancies. So as you work through these long timelines, and Tim's going to talk more about this, there can be turnover and staff changes. There can be timeline discrepancies in the negotiation itself, where maybe a city is ready and the railroad isn't, or the railroad's ready and the city doesn't have the funding line up. And by the time the city gets the funding lined up, the valuation maybe changes because it's been 5 or 10 years. Usually there's inflation. There might be, more valuation that happens just from development around it happening, whatever the case is. These are really common challenges that we see. Staff turnover, they leave, advocates leave, people pass away, right? The people working on it, the people at the railroad, you might have A railroad could be taken over by a corporation, and you have different staff to work with all of a sudden. So all of these things can happen. Community opposition, although we think there's ways you can get out ahead of this and get community buy-in early on. Tim's going to talk about that too. I talked about resource and funding constraints a moment ago, but do you have the funding lined up at the moment that the railroad's really interested in selling, or is it going to take you a really long time to line up that funding? And then if you choose to railbank, working through, it's a great process. I'll talk about it in a moment, but working through what that means, working through that process, getting the right advice, and also thinking about what are those future use rights for the trail manager or the city and the railroad. Next slide, please. So railbanking is a great option. It's not your only option. Just want to be clear about that. It is also a very complex process that there is not time, nor is it our intention to teach you all about railbanking on today's webinar. We have many great resources, including past webinars where we go into great detail about it. So I think we are putting in the chat right now links to those resources and encourage you to dive in. I'm just going to give you a really cursory overview for a few slides because Damien and Tim are going to touch on it. So we just want you to have a basic overview. So to do that basic overview, let's go back to 1983, the establishment of the Railbanking Amendment to the National Trail System Act. This came out of a recognition that these corridors were being lost with deindustrialization. You could never stitch these corridors back together again. People started to realize that and say, hey, we have to protect these. And if we do that, they could also be used as trails, as interim uses. If the railroad wanted to then reactivate, decades later, then it would still be there. We wouldn't lose these corridors. So that's the fundamental idea. The trail is actually considered an interim use. You have to think about this in long stretches of time. And that, the railroad, if you railbank the railroad, what's great is that the railroad has the incentive to think about reactivating it later on. So walking through other ways of thinking about this, it's a pre-abandonment strategy, meaning it happens during and as part of the abandonment process. They start off kind of at the same point, but then they ultimately take different paths from then if you just did abandonment. It's a voluntary agreement between the railroad and the trail manager. The Surface Transportation Board oversees it all throughout this process. Like I said, the line can be reactivated for future use. This is really the key benefit to the railroads, and why railroads, if they really understand it, why they like railbanking. And it preempts state law with regards to reversionary rights. That's a huge benefit. And then it has been successfully defended at the Supreme Court level. So this is a great, again, not your only tool, but it's a great tool. Next slide, please. So for trail managers, why is railbanking a benefit? It keeps the corridor intact regardless of how the land was assembled. So basically railbanking says you cannot break this up, and say, oh, you have a section over here, you have a section over here, there's this gap here. It keeps it all together. That was the whole point of railbanking, is that you're preserving this connected linear corridor. Because it is a benefit to the railroads to railbank, it may improve your negotiating position. We say may, right? Because there's so many other pieces to negotiating, and Damien will talk about those. But it may improve your negotiating position if you pursue railbanking. The next slide, what are the benefits to the railroads? Well, I already talked about it preserves that reactivation right for the future, which is huge. Then the railroad doesn't have to, worry about losing that future business opportunity. That can create goodwill in the community by allowing it to become this, trail as an amazing amenity for the community. It allows for negotiations with only one party. There has to be one party as part of the notice of interim use. There could be other parties involved, and Tim will talk about that, but ultimately one person representing, from the community side. It removes the need to investigate historic corridor assemblage. So, if you're having to piece together a linear corridor, like who owns this bit, who owns section B, who owns section D, you could have a million sections in theory. This just says it resolves all the ownership issues, and it makes it very clear who owns it. And it removes liability for existing trestles and tunnels, which is huge. They can just be what they are, and it can go forward under that corridor. So the next slide goes into the rail banking process. This, again, is a really cursory overview. I am not going to walk through this. We're going to post a link right now in the chat for how to rail bank, and we encourage you, again, go through that. We have some great videos and other resources, and next week you could ask, if you kind of read up on this and you have questions, we're happy to answer those on next week's full Q&A session. We will have time for some Q&A today. So next slide, advice. What's our advice on these negotiations? And you'll hear a lot more from Damien and Tim momentarily. But number one, research the railroad's priorities, operational needs, potential concerns, and incorporate these considerations into your proposal. They are a business entity. So just like you would investigate or research, any other party that you have to work with as you do advocacy or as you do acquisition, and all of those things that are part of trail development, understand where they're coming from, find out as much as you can to try to meet them where they're at and have, a favorable set of negotiation terms to come with. Don't assume a corridor should or will be donated. Again, you're dealing with a business enterprise. These corridors have tremendous value. We don't want to go into a negotiation just assuming that it should be donated. You can do other creative ways of thinking through a negotiation. Damien will talk through some of those creative ways of thinking through it, but you don't want to go in and just ask for a donation. You want to be prepared for long timelines and plan for succession accordingly. I talked a little bit about that. Tim will talk more about it. You want to conduct community outreach from the start. So you want to have that community buy-in early on before you get too far down the line. Many people on both sides, and this is probably the most important point I'll make, don't fully understand the complexities and benefits of rail banking. I have seen very sophisticated city governments, world-class cities, that their attorneys don't fully understand the complexities of rail banking. So if you, and some railroads like CSX, that Damien's going to talk about, do understand rail banking, many of them don't really even know what it is or how it works or why it may benefit them. So just go in assuming that you yourself and the others that you're working with are going to need to be really educated on rail banking, and seek out people who truly have expertise in how it works. And if you need our help, we're here to help you. And partner with attorneys, appraisers, corridor specialists who also have this experience in rail banking, and I would just say in rail trails in general. To wrap up, what's our role to play? We do an early warning system where we can tell you that abandonments have been filed by the STB. We provide quick assist technical assistance. If you give us a call or an email, we defend rail banking politically and legally. And we do have our general counsel, Andrea Furster, who you'll get to meet on next week's dialogue, and happy to ask her questions. And we have lots of great resources on our website. The page on the right that you see, the image on the right, is the page we're launching today, working with railroads on rail trail conversions. We're going to launch the video from today on here. We have all new content that has been posted already today on how to do this negotiation work and partnership work with railroads. And even what we learned from this group today, and those of you with your questions, will keep updating this page with new information. I would be remiss if I didn't also direct you to the link at the bottom of this page, and that'll be posted in the chat as well. This is our legal review of rail trail conversions. It will go more into the potential for takings, and that's like a whole other days-long webinar, but there's good summaries in that legal review, and just make sure you're educating yourself on what takings are and the potential for takings in that legal review document. It's very easy to read. So I mentioned our page is launching today. We have a resource library you can go through, and other past webinars and online dialogues. And with that, I am so excited to have Damien Deanna with CSX Railroad. He's the Director of Real Estate, and we're thrilled to have him be able to speak from the railroad's perspective on how to pursue rail trail negotiations. So I'll hand it over to you, Damien.
Thank you, Liz. So again, my name is Damien Deanna. I'm the Director of Sales and Leasing here at CSX. I want to thank Liz, Yvonne, and the entire Rails to Trails Conservancy for both setting up this webinar and for everything you guys do to make Trail Nation a reality. So just talking a little bit about how CSX, as one of the Class 1 railroads, approaches rail trail transactions. Our experience dealing with trails has taught us that, as Liz kind of talked about, that it can be a long, lengthy, arduous process to get from historically used rail corridor to active recreational trail. And, we've found that the best way to make sure that those things happen is that it requires a collaborative approach. And so what we see is one of the biggest challenges that comes into play when we're trying to negotiate these transactions is that there are significant differences between a typical trail transaction or a typical commercial transaction and a rails to trails conveyance. Liz kind of touched on these things a little bit, and each one of these bullet points could be their own hour-long seminar on the intricacies involved. The most important thing that I would point out is that, typically when we're dealing with a government entity or a municipality that's coming in to buy one of these trails, typically a government entity only has, a list of contractors that you can typically use to get about an appraisal or a survey, get title work or environmental work done. And that short list of approved vendors probably doesn't include anybody that's valued a corridor before or done survey work on a 3-mile long piece of property and, written a meets and bound legal description that's 30 pages long, or pulled title from and read the calligraphy on a deed from 150 years ago to understand where the bounds of the corridor are. All of those things end up being something that, what Rails to Trails Conservancy does and providing resources to help educate buyers on how to get through all of that due diligence so that you as a trail buyer have the wherewithal to get to the end on a transaction. Every one of those things is, kind of the reason why Rails to Trails Conservancy exists. And it's also why CSX has, we see this as a very collaborative approach where we work with buyers to help identify contractors that can do those things. And then it's the reason why we are very open to creative deal structures that, where we can come alongside a buyer and kind of bridge the gap between the railroad's expectations and the regulatory environment and where a buyer is. So we see so much value in what trail sponsors do that we're actually willing to contribute a portion of the purchase price to help fund what the trail sponsors do. So there's organizations out there, when we talk about trail sponsors, Rails to Trails Conservancy, they're more of an advocacy and, group, but there's also trail sponsors out there like Open Spaces Institute, the Trust for Public Land. They'll actually come and, the railroad can convey the corridor to the trail sponsor, and then the trail sponsor can convey it to the ultimate buyer and trail manager. And then that gives the municipality and the buyer the flexibility to lean on the trail sponsor to do a lot of these due diligence items, to educate council members or community groups on all of the various issues here. And in our experience, these things become so much more successful and likely to happen when a trail sponsor is involved that we're willing to contribute a portion of the purchase price. Just as a reminder, I'm talking for CSX. Don't assume every Class 1 railroad thinks that way, but that's been our experience. We are also, Liz touched on it a little bit, that there can be timing issues with the community and the buyer appropriating funds. And so you can have a conversation and negotiate a transaction with the railroad, and you end up 2-3 years later still trying to work on all of the things that need to be done to transact that corridor, and the value might have changed. And so we've, over the years, we've gotten much more flexible with allowing for a long enough closing timeline for there to be contingencies on closing related to funding. We also strongly encourage and are open to allowing trail buyers to either buy the corridor in segments, or we can sell we've financed trails before where we sell a corridor and we either put a purchase option in place for future segments or sell the entire thing with a mortgage put on there, so that so that we can get to a transaction and allow the municipality to start owning something that, then it gets easier to come and buy the future segments or raise the fundings to satisfy a mortgage, once you get funding for the second and third phase, that kind of thing. And, we've also looked at doing leases of corridors, and just putting a purchase option in the lease agreement. And all of those creative deal structures are really around just giving the community time to raise the funds, to not just acquire the corridor, but also, there's a significant amount of funding that has to be there to get through all the due diligence items and to develop the trail. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to kind of transition and give some recommendations to trail managers and trail buyers on things you can do before you engage with the railroad, and once you engage with the railroad, for how to have those conversations. And the goal here really is to get to the point where you have a willing and able buyer and a willing and able seller. And I kind of characterize it that way because obviously if you're reaching out to the railroad, you're obviously a willing buyer, but getting to the point where you've done the things before you reach out to the railroad to be an able buyer is what's really important. And then when you're talking to the railroad, most railroads they're able sellers, but getting them to the point where they're a willing seller is the goal. And so, before you engage with the railroad, making sure that you have community and government support, top down, is really important. I've seen where, we get into these things and maybe the city council wants it, but the mayor doesn't, that kind of stuff. Really ensuring that you've got all the support, making sure you've identified who's actually going to buy this corridor. Is there going to be a trail sponsor involved? Who's ultimately going to own, develop, and maintain the corridor, and where that funding is going to come from. All of that stuff is important to be thinking about before you're reaching out to the railroad. Vetting the buyer's wherewithal to transact a corridor and develop the trail. Doing your research, having, using RTC's resources to make sure that there's a game plan there and that you really have that wherewithal before you talk to the railroad's important. And I put the line of sight to funding here, and I got the little asterisk there because, it becomes a huge catch-22, going and getting grant funding before you have a purchase agreement in place, isn't really, applicable. And it's so where, when buyers reach out to us, we definitely understand that there's likely, where the funding is going to come from might still be a question, but at least having thought through that, are you going to be funding this with bond funding or appropriating, looking for state and federal appropriations? At least thinking through those things is definitely important before you engage with the railroad. And as you're going through all of those resources and doing your own upfront due diligence, that's when I think you consider reaching out to groups like the Trust for Public Land and Open Spaces Institute, and there's the Conservancy Trust and other groups that can come alongside and facilitate a transaction. and then so some things that, we kind of see, hearing from the railroad on kind of our perspective, I think it's really important when you engage with the railroad that you're patient, recognize, in the bio that, I put that in there about, you're likely dealing with somebody at the railroad who, one, our primary focus as railroad real estate folks is serving our customers, and we buy and sell real estate to support entities that want to do, move freight rail with us. And that is the primary focus. And while, because of rail banking, there's an incentive for CSX and railroads to be involved in those things, we also have a lot of other things going on. And so, just because of who you're dealing with, and then because of the long process, both regulatory and due diligence wise, that being patient is important. Understanding how the railroads value their corridor is really important. I appreciate what Liz said about, not assuming it's going to be donated, but just also understanding, the railroads feel, we believe that our rail corridors are extremely valuable. They're essentially, from an economic standpoint, irreplaceable. It's why why rail banking exists, because once a corridor goes away, it's next to impossible to replace them. And then, recognizing that railroads aren't real estate companies. I've touched on that. The other big thing that we'll deal with, no matter how large a transaction is, whether, we're negotiating a rail corridor in West Virginia or in, in a downtown area of Washington, D.C., we're very concerned, not necessarily about the dollars and what that'll mean to the company, but, every trail that we do becomes a precedent and a comp for future trail conversations. And so, it might be really easy for a railroad in theory to, donate a corridor that's worth tens of thousands of dollars versus a corridor that's worth millions. But we're very concerned about the precedent that would be caused if, we do something below market value on a corridor. And then the other piece of advice that I would give, and I put it at the end because it should be the last thing that you do, but if you're working with the Class 1, trying to get the attention of a Class 1 railroad or any railroad, and you've done everything on beforehand to get, to vet your wherewithal and ensure community support, it is appropriate, if it's done in the right way, to have, your government affairs folks and public affairs folks reach out to the government affairs folks at the railroad if you're having trouble getting the real estate folks to be responsive. So, we get those kind of inquiries. CSX doesn't get offended when that happens. We get it. Where one of the reasons we want to do these things is because of the value they bring to the community. And so if you go the government affairs route, that doesn't offend CSX. I'll kind of leave it there and go ahead and turn it over to Tim Bartlett.
Great, thank you. Glad everybody's here today. Thanks for having me. I'm Tim Bartlett. I'm the Executive Director at the Urbana Park District. I'm here representing our trail partners. We have Champaign County Forest Preserve District and the Vermilion County Conservation District. Today, I want to give a little brief overview, some history, talk about our development strategy, and then identify a couple of challenges we're having right now, and then end with hopefully some tips or things we've learned. Spend a little time on this first slide. Want to draw your attention. On the left, we have Champaign County. The gray line in between separates us to Vermilion County, and you can see the orange line, both the dashed and solid. Solid is the existing trail built to date, and the dashed is our future trail that we're working on right now. A little bit of our brief history. We started on this 25-mile corridor way back in about 1994. I serve on a local foundation, Champaign County Design and Conservation Foundation. We were the group that was tapped with the opportunity of seeking out this corridor that was rail banked and trying to move it to an acquisition and ultimately develop it. We spent about the first 6 years, starting in about 1994, but around Year 2000, we had learned or were notified that, unfortunately, that Conrail, Consolidated Rail Corporation, who owned the corridor at that time, had, unbeknownst to us, sold it all to CSX. So we were very disappointed to learn that, reached out around 2000, started working with CSX, only to learn that they did not recognize any donation and that we essentially had to start our negotiation process over. So we have a typical 30-year history, like many corridors. Around 2010, we found a little more success working with Senator Dick Durbin in Illinois. We received some funding through our Illinois Transportation Enhancement Program that really helped us start our kickoff with phase 1 and phase 2 work. That led to gaining a lot more information, building relationships along this corridor. You'll notice we have 2 urban centers on the left or on the far west side, Urbana on the far east side, city of Danville. In between, we have a number of small towns, and we have a number of parks and natural resource areas that can be accessed or could be future connections. So it's a really great location for our area. Ultimately, rolling up to about 2018, when we received funding through our state legislators, state senators, locally, Senator Scott Bennett and Representative Carol Ammons provided $11.2 million for us to build the rest of our corridor out. Around, I skipped over around 2012, 2013 is when we actually negotiated the final sale with CSX. And that plan was that our foundation would hand off the Champaign County portion to the Forest Preserve and the Vermilion section to the Conservation District. Next slide. Another critical partner in our success was the state of Illinois. We had a situation, if you're remembering from the first map, as we head east toward Danville, we come right next to the Vermilion County Fairgrounds and the Kickapoo State Park. Because the state had involvement and owned the lands and the properties, they ultimately agreed they would take on and own and develop the big bridge. So this really gave us that iconic bridge. And it really happened at a critical time, kind of before all the trail work was done, to give people a reason to want to come here. This is a gateway park or corridor. You come in from Indiana into Illinois. Kickapoo State Park's the first state park, and this is what we could offer to visitors. One of the things that we did, moving on into construction, you can see we have those dashed lines where we're kind of moving in some of these smaller communities. The images above show the existing conditions with the vacated rail corridor, and down below is how we hope to connect. Just wanted to point out we have a lot of opportunities to work with the rail companies in situations like this, as well as the community. Open space, trails, could be a park, but we also have the ability to host infrastructure for the rails if they needed storage or any other types of infrastructure. I think the opportunity is there. Next slide, please. Now I want to pivot to a couple of problems. The next 2 slides are challenging for us. As you'll see here, as we're near Ogden, in between St. Joe and Ogden, Illinois, we have underlying rights where our trail corridor, as depicted in the final lower picture, crosses the Union Pacific corridor. We've been dealing with this from the very beginning. We knew there was an issue at the Glover crossing. We've been trying to reach out and communicate to Union Pacific that we have a solution, we just need their cooperation. So again, trying to compel other rail companies that might crisscross or overlap your corridor can add to more delays and more challenges. We're hoping we can reach out and finally get this to a solution. Next slide, please. And then as we come into Urbana, I want to highlight, this was sort of the big reason that I know Urbana and the Urbana Park District's been involved. Kind of see the unimproved vacated trail in that upper right portion, and then it kind of leads up to this busy intersection off Illinois Route 150 as it comes into Urbana. Now I want to draw your attention to the lower slide. You'll see a couple of land parcels marked A, B, C, and D. Below that is Weaver Park. That is our destination and our home for our trailhead facility here in Urbana. But we have an unusual situation. If you look just over to the right toward the east, we own that corridor right up to where it says University Avenue, and that was the end of what CSX owned. Norfolk Southern owns sections A and B. A continues to run into downtown Urbana and further west into Champaign. So we're trying to strategize right now, and as we understand, there's a moratorium on corridor sales, and we're trying to pivot and convince Norfolk Southern that a long-term lease would be a reasonable option on that section B. I want to point out we've kind of pivoted our development strategy, moving away from Smith Road, the normal street break, and we have a local friends group, Friends of the Grand Prairie, who willingly purchased in a collaborative way parcels C and D, which would give us access with a mid-block crossing right to Weaver Park. Next slide, please. Once you could cross the street there at Main Street, this would be the location, and this is our development plan for our main gateway and our trailhead facility at Weaver Park for the Urbana Park District, which would include a large pavilion for events, restrooms, information, wayfinding, bike fix-it stations, bike storage, space for events. Next slide, please. And this is the overall setting. We've got about over 80 acres of open space between two parks that we've developed a new master plan. If you look at the upper parcel there in the far left corner near where it says East Main Street, that shows kind of where our trailhead facility will sit in this larger park. It also has about a mile loop trail through the park and connects to our health and wellness center down in that lower portion on the lower left. So we've got a terrific way to bring the corridor in. We've got some challenges that we need to overcome, and working with the railroads to get those issues resolved would be very helpful. Last slide, I wanted to kind of hit a few tips. I have a lot here, so I'll try to go as quick as possible. Obviously, Damien mentioned a few of these, but definitely get organized. It's really critical that you cannot start a process with the hope of getting organized. You have to be ready to go. Get educated on all trail development strategies. I think we just started with the good hopes people would be kind and give us land. Obviously, we've become educated over those 30 years, so we've learned a lot. Establish compelling trail facts. Why is the trail necessary? How can you build your case? Obviously, cooperate, collaborate, partnerships. I think I shared, the example of work with the state of Illinois to take on that large bridge. That was a huge part. Plan for funding. Damien covered that as well. But early on and long term, I think we limped along from our first financial need until the next without kind of putting a whole plan together of development strategy. Communicate clearly, one voice, please. The railroads are busy. I think they are willing to talk with us, but we have to get our acts together and be ready to go when they engage with us. Develop flexible goals. We noticed where we started is not where we ended up. So you have to be flexible. Establish values for everything. There's value on both sides. Obviously, we thought we could provide solutions for utilities, green infrastructure, right-of-way needs, drainage infrastructure, roads and bridges. All of it's very important. Stay in dialogue, maintain good relations. It's very easy to get off track or let things die, especially over 30 years. I think Liz mentioned succession. I think I've outlived 3 or 4 of our other trail managers through this 30-year process. So having things that you can pass on so that others can pick up. Work with the railroad's government affairs. I'll be honest, that was a key change in our situation with CSX. Once we started engaging with their government affairs, they were able to better communicate our intents. Lots of costs to consider. Again, avoid extraneous costs. Be focused on really what it's going to take. Established budgets. That's what we didn't do. And I would definitely put together some draft budgets that might take on maybe 5-year windows. Negotiate fairly on both sides. It's just really critical that we bring our best game. I know we negotiated fairly by working with our Illinois Department of Natural Resources. They had a realty division. They have bought and been involved in a lot of corridor transactions. Were extremely helpful, and they helped us probably get where we needed to be. And I think, again, Damien mentioned it, but I think you can be both demanding and be patient at the same time. And by demanding, I mean demanding attention and really trying to tighten those timelines. We'd really like to see corridor projects not take 30 years. While there's a lot of reasons they could go long, there's every opportunity, especially with rail bank corridors, to try to cut through a lot of that and get down to a reasonable negotiation that you can close a deal with. I think that was the end of my tips.
Thank you, Tim and Damien. That was wonderful. We have so many amazing questions coming in, so we'll try in 14 minutes to get through all of them. Some of them are really great for our part 2 next week. So please do register for part 2 and come. We're not going to do presentations. We're just going to do Q&A, and we'll have our staff and Andrea Firster, our general counsel, on, so we can get into a lot of legal type questions, but a lot are here for you, Damien. So let me tee up one for you. What do you see as like the most common challenges railroads face when negotiating with trail organizations on rail trail projects, and how, since the majority of the audience is, trail planners and advocates, how can we be prepared to address these challenges when we go into these negotiations?
Yeah, I'd say one of the, and we've touched on it a little bit, but the challenge and the disparity between what a lot of communities see as, hey, there's this corridor sitting here and the railroad's not using it, why don't they just give it to us? Or even coming up with what's an appropriate value for the corridor. And I'd say that, seeing how the railroad views these corridors, I mean, most rail corridors weren't just given to the railroad. There's, you see a lot of in pop culture, there's, TV shows and movies where like the railroad put down the tracks and they just owned the property on either side because they did. And that really isn't accurate, especially on the East Coast. Every piece of land that we own, I could find a deed that shows how we got it and what we paid for it 150 years ago. And so not only did we invest resources to assemble the trail, then we had to manage this asset, pay taxes on it, manage it from a property management standpoint, deal with all the legal and liability issues. People come onto the property and trip and fall over the years. Like, a lot of money and generations went into assembling and maintaining these corridors, and they are extremely valuable. And there's a reason people are talking to the railroad about the value of that corridor versus just go build your own trail somewhere else in the city. And so helping educate buyers on why these things are valuable and why they're being appraised the way they are. I'd say that. And then the catch-22 on funding, property value, both because of inflation, and most places property values are increasing all the time. And that's why we came up with the creative deal structures, because I could tell you there was a trail in Alabama that went on for 15 years. Every 2 years they call us and say, hey, we raised $1 million. And we were like, all right, well, let's go get an appraisal. And the corridor came in at 2 million. And then they came back a couple of years later and we're like, we have 2 million. And we're like, well, now it's worth 2.5, and that, I'm happy to say this week we're actually signing a purchase agreement on that one, where we sold it for half the value and put a mortgage on the other half, and finally fixed the catch-22 by being creative.
That's great. I love the creativity on that transaction. I'm going to play off of that give a question to Tim. So knowing what Damien just shared, these projects take a really long time, and we're all working together on these creative solutions to try to shrink that timeline. But what's your advice from the other side of the negotiation, Tim, on how do you keep the project momentum going through these different, cycles and people changing, all those things?
Very good question. First, I think having the right leaders, right organizations. In our case, we had our, parks, forest preserves, conservation districts. We have a vested interest in creating a linear park, essentially. So this is really critical. to us. I think really, again, I think creating opportunities to share the value of what corridors bring. For example, there are a lot of collaborative things we learn that are probably vested interest by the rail companies in future utilities. How do we deal with drainage, crossings, other, let's call it infrastructure that we all have needs in. So if we can help focus on those opportunities, maybe there's something that will benefit both groups. So keeping the groups together. I did want to mention, I think we need to think much more creatively today. You know, our country is urbanizing quickly. I think we're realizing we need every modal form of transportation. So biking, hiking, walking. We know our corridors in a university community will ultimately be used for getting people to school or getting them to work. So I think we need more creative opportunities to work with trail managers and the rail companies. And I'd like to maybe leave it here on this one. You know, our extension into downtown Urbana, into the University of Illinois and downtown Champaign is probably going to require some sort of shared corridor use. If there's an active line, why can't we design and develop and manage shared use trails? That's going to be a reality, I think, for our future. I don't think we're going to, maybe find these far-flung rural corridors that are just perfect for a recreational experience, but they won't interrupt any urban situations. We need to start planning together and bringing those ideas, to our communities as solutions for everybody.
That's awesome. Thanks. Thanks so much, Tim. I love that mindset. Damien, since we have you live here, everyone's chomping at the bit to ask the railroad guy all the questions. So I'm going to try to go rapid fire and do as much as we can, but we'll figure out a way to try to help facilitate these questions even afterwards, as long as Damien's okay with that. So Damien, from Courtney in Pittsburgh, do the railroads take into consideration current conditions and other environmental issues when valuing the corridor? From what I have seen with corridor appraisals, it does not seem to take that into account. Is there value in having site visits with CSX staff at prospective purchase sites, since not all staff are familiar or local to those project sites?
Yeah, I would say one part of that collaborative approach from CSX is a willingness to do exactly that, to meet on site, walk the trail, Liz and I have done that in DC with trail groups. So it is it is a good thing to propose. Be patient, recognize that it ain't the only thing that person's working on at the railroad, but it's worth it. I'm going to take it in two steps. So the environmental piece, there is a, when you're talking about a recreational trail, taking something that used to be industrial, exposure to the soil is a big concern. But there aren't, typically the development plan to build the trail, meaning you're going to put an asphalt cap down where people are going to be walking, that development plan, which you'd have to do anyways for the trail, usually satisfies the environmental issues. And from what it's worth, most of the comps that are used to appraise, to come up with the value had very similar development costs, right? So that being said, I'll tell you, CSX, one of the things we do is, in the due diligence process, when you're doing environmental testing, if we find that there's a hot spot where soil actually has to be removed from the site, that is an extraordinary thing. It happens very rarely with these things, but we've had a willingness to take, that cost, because it is extraordinary and not every trail requires soil to be taken off site, that we've reduced our purchase prices to help cover that cost, because it is an impact to value. Some of the other things that conditions that we see, in an appraisal world, when you appraise something, you appraise it based on its highest and best use. And if there's a condition of the corridor that has to be satisfied to get to that highest and best use, and I've seen one, their corridors are really valuable because all the connectivity is there. But if there's a bridge that has to be replaced to keep correct that, or to get to that highest and best use and create that captivity or connectivity, that cost to cure should be taken into account by an appraiser. So there are certain conditions of the now, if it's extremely wooded or overgrown, some of that stuff I wouldn't look at as a deduct from value, but there are certain considerations that impact value, and I think looking at it and asking an appraiser, are these legitimate costs to cure? That's how I would put it.
Thanks. Okay, Damien, let's see if we could squeeze in maybe 2 more if we go fast. A railroad told us they were not, oh, sorry, I don't want to do that one. That was a good one, but let me do a different one. From Andrea in Iowa, what factors go into a railroad making the decision to discontinue use? There are lines in my area with only one run daily at low speeds over a portion of the corridor. Others are no longer running at all and are sporadically used for storage. How can we work with a railroad in a situation like this?
Yep.
And that one's really, really common. I hear that a lot.
Yeah, and that is part of understanding how the railroad's looking at it. I'll tell you, so one, from a regulatory standpoint, it is extremely difficult unless you have a lot of interested people in discontinuing something, unless it's been over 2 years without a customer. But the thing we'll hear all the time is, oh, well, the railroad hasn't used this for 7 years or 10 years. That's like, in the life of a railroad, 7 to 10 years is nothing, right? And if we think, there's been some pretty extraordinary economic times over the last 20 years, right? And whether those things continue or, there's all kinds of stuff going on right now in the global economy with onshoring and people bringing manufacturing back to the United States. So it isn't unreasonable for the railroad to have this interest in, hey, maybe we want to hold on to this before we go down that path. Now, the rail banking thing, and the last thing a community wants is us, you're going to rail bank a corridor, and then 2 years later we come back and say, well, hey, onshoring happened and now we're bringing this back. So that's hopefully that kind of addresses a little bit of how the railroad thinks about it.
Just a really quick follow-up, what motivates, from your perspective, a rail company to do a rail bank specifically on a corridor?
So there are a lot of costs involved with keeping the rail there, and the rail itself. So I'll tell you, there's our operating folks will come to us sometimes and say, hey, we want to abandon this, so that, because part of the regulatory requirement on it is that you got to keep the rail in. We have a common carrier obligation to serve customers on that line, and even if it's been years without it, while it's regulated, we can't rip the track up. And there's a ton of value in that rail for us. So there'll be groups within our company that'll say, hey, we want to abandon this corridor just to be able to go scrap the rail and to not have to keep maintaining all of the road crossings and the signal infrastructure and all of that. So when that happens, that is a non-real estate motivation for us to get involved in. At that point, we start looking to see, hey, can we find a trail buyer for this so that we can have our cake and eat it too, so that we can scrap the rail, get out of some of the maintenance costs, make some money selling a trail, and keep the connectivity there if we ever need to come back in the future.
Thanks so much. This went so fast. Damien, would you be okay? Sorry to put you on the spot. Would you be okay if we helped facilitate getting some of these questions answered with you offline?
Really happy to do it.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And thank you, Tim. It was so great to have both of your perspectives at the same time. We encourage everyone to please join us next week for the follow-up, where we can probably answer a lot more of these. So I'm going to turn it over to Yvonne.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you. It's past 2 o'clock. Thank you for your time, and we have a lot more programming for you. Hope we'll see you at next week's session. Thank you to all our presenters, and have a lovely day.